I'm Hillary Wilmoth. I work on the marketing team for a number of the journals, including Inorganic Chemistry and JACS, who are editors are here for, and Analytical Chemistry, so this whole panel. They're just going to talk to you about some of the common questions about submitting a manuscript, what to do with reviewer comments, etc. So first step, we have Kenneth Poeppelmeier from Inorganic Chemistry.
Well, you don't get caught there. Good morning, all. So I can just operate this by going forward from here, right? No remote. Okay. Again, I'm Ken Poeppelmeier, so hello to everyone. I'm at Northwestern University, but some of you, if you're more at Argonne, you might also recognize I'm also, for the last year, been working in the Chemical Sciences and Engineering Division in Emilio's office as the Associate Director for Science. So I've coupled my career at Northwestern with that of Argonne in the last year. But before we even get started on that, I just thought I'd say a little bit about myself because of what we're doing today with publishing and the fact that some of you, I think, are undergraduates at various colleges that are here doing research for the summer, and probably most of you, though, are postdocs. So my first experience, I don't have to say when, but it was quite a long time ago, was at another Department of Energy lab, the Ames lab, between my junior and senior years when I was an undergraduate at the University of Missouri. So that's at Iowa State University. And from that 2 or 3 months of summer research, a paper was published, and in fact it was in Inorganic Chemistry, so it was my first publication. During graduate school, there was another connection to Argonne in the sense that I came out here to do some experiments in the chemistry division using what was first called the technique ESCA, which is now more commonly known, I guess, as XPS. And it was the first ESCA instrument in the Midwest, and so as a graduate student, I came and ran experiments, collected data, so a lot of you probably relate to that. So it's clear that there's a lot of experience that goes into being a scientist, and many of you are just starting. So during lunch and whatever, if you wanted to talk about that step in publishing, I'd be really happy to. But today, what I think I was asked to do was to talk about it from the perspective of the American Chemical Society. And in my case, it's inorganic chemistry. But what we'll be talking about is completely general. So choosing a journal. You've done some research, and now that's working with the folks, the collaborators, and your supervisor, your PhD advisor, or whatever. Perhaps the first question is full paper or communications. And this varies from journal to journal, but more or less, I think, what I'm going to describe here is what most journals have adopted. And it's always important to differentiate. Communications are meant to communicate something important and quickly to the broad audience of that journal. Full papers are usually, but not always, follow in due time on that same topic, and often to the same journal. So over the years, many times, communications that I've worked with various authors have led to a full paper in inorganic chemistry. Sometimes you can switch to another journal. For example, I think many times you'll find a communication in JACS. I know I have published in JACS, but the full paper may come out in inorganic chemistry. So what journal is appropriate? JACS, Inorganic Chemistry, Journal of Physical Chemistry, or other organizations that publish? It really all depends, and you have different audiences, and they all specialize, obviously, to a different degree. And so that's something you really need to talk about amongst yourselves and discuss with your supervisor or your PhD advisor, and then plan accordingly. Okay, the first step, though, is obviously you have to write the submission letter. And usually the letter is written by the corresponding author, who often, of course, is the principal investigator on the grant or the project or your major professor. But in my experience, it's always the case that several of the authors, all of the authors participate in that. And it's really important, so even as somebody who's just writing your very first paper, or you're writing a paper in graduate school, it's really important to recognize people do read them, right? They don't go off into a black hole. And it's really probably the most important first step of submission. The editor, Joe, we do read them. So address it as to the editor-in-chief, whoever it is, and the journal by name. It always surprises me, even this is, I would say that about 20, 30% of the letters that we get at Inorganic Chemistry just still say, "Dear Sir," or "Dear Editor," or something. And in our case, the editor-in-chief is Richie Eisenberg, and one should address it to him. And in our case, all the articles go to him, and then he'll subdivide them to the associate editors. And in the body of the letter, if you think it's really appropriate for a certain associated editor, that's one of the facts that you can say. But please address it to the editor. You don't have, "Dear Sir," is you don't have to do that, right? And as I just said, you may request a particular section of the journal and or a particular associate editor, depending upon how the journal is organized. And in the worst case scenario is that the editor-in-chief maybe doesn't agree with the associate editor that you've listed, but he almost always does. And in my experience, when the editor-in-chief sends it to someone else, don't take that personally at all. It's usually just that the workload for that week or that period of 2 weeks is just, for some unknown reason, shifted a lot, in that the associate editors are experts usually in some sub-area of that field. And for example, Richie may not want to send me 12 manuscripts that week because I already have too many, and he just has to put them with another associate editor. And there's several of us that can be editors for various topics. So even though you may list a particular associate editor, there's never any hidden agenda there if it happens to go to a different editor. So remember that. Okay, in the body of the letter, of course, you want to communicate the main message of the paper, and in non-technical terms. And then I say in one paragraph. Okay, maybe two. The point is, don't make it too long of a letter. And when you want to communicate the main message, there can be various points, but it still surprises me after 15 plus years of doing this. Some letters are rather complicated to get through. So just imagine you're the editor-in-chief, and he has 20 or 30 or 40 of these to do in a week or something like this. Quite a lot that's coming across his desk, his or her desk. And so it's important to make it as brief, not too brief, but concise, communicate the main message of why this is important for this journal. And on the non-technical aspects of it, that's where it gets a little interesting, perhaps. So, I mean, we all are scientists, and so our natural inclination is to be rather technical, and so that's okay up to a point, right? But try to strike some balance on the technical side. Okay, communicate the main. Okay, why? And the first thing is really, why is this paper important? And connect that to the idea of why is it important for the general audience of that journal. And the ACS is really, really good at having a whole, a lot of, how many journals are there at ACS? 30, 40 now? And there's, in the last few years, there's probably been 10. There was, new journals, right? So there's lots of topics, and picking the right one, and for the general audience of that journal. And that's not so easy maybe for me to communicate to you. It's discuss that with your co-authors, how you might approach that, and sometimes there's several choices, and you'll go from there. All right. Okay, the next step is handling reviewer comments. The most important thing that I want to communicate today, especially for the younger people in the audience, or if you've not published a paper yet, or you're publishing your first paper, do not take things personally if the reviewer is too critical. And again, there's a lot that goes into that. The selection of the reviewers, the part of the world where the reviewer comes from, the customs that that particular person, that region, etc. You do need to have a thick skin to play this game in some sense. I don't want to emphasize that. Maybe that's a bit too strong to say that, because in fact I want to be I want to compliment the reviewers. Generally, and in almost all cases, the reviewers are really trying to do a good job. Anyway, always be polite in your responses. Be thoughtful about how you respond. Do not second-guess reviewers or the editors. I can assure you there's really no hidden agenda here. Everyone is trying to really have peer review work. Over the years, I think I've heard a lot of discussions about peer review. There's probably plenty to criticize in peer review about the process, but in my opinion, we have to have peer review, and it's the best thing, and that's what really keeps science going. Okay. In your resubmission letter and manuscript, really address the points raised, as many as possible. Now, sometimes in reviews, of course, there's something about dotting an I and crossing a T. We're not talking about that. You don't have to address every absolute point, but all the points that make sense to address, please address them in your response. And don't ignore the reviewer's comments. This is where the step as being an editor. So I'm the editor, we've had it reviewed, I get all this information back, and I'm going to spend the majority of my time on this manuscript, probably at this point in time. And I'm talking, what do I mean by a majority of my time? I mean, I can spend anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, maybe, on a typical paper at this point. Because I really want to go back again, although I have already read the reviewer's comments and sent them back to the authors. We've got the revision back. But I'm going to rather carefully go review the case again and review the situation and think of, and see that the comments that were raised by the reviewers are addressed by the authors. Okay? The next step in this, of course, depending upon how complicated that review has been, is the papers sometimes go back to the reviewers. This is the re-review step. And perhaps Joe will give another statistic on this, but I would say at inorganic chemistry, it's 40% of the time. I don't think it's 50. I don't think it's half. Maybe 40% of the time, the paper will go back to the authors for a second revision. And most of the time, at that point, the revisions are very different and of a much more of a minor character. Okay. Then I wanted to bring up this last point. I hope everyone can read it, especially if you're sitting in the back of the room. You may request a new or another reviewer, but explain why in this case. This does not happen very often, but sometimes already at this review stage, there's really a conflict has developed in terms of what maybe the reviewer has said or what the authors really are intending in terms of what they are publishing in their manuscript. So for various reasons, you can request another reviewer on the re-review stage. But again, just in my experience, that does not happen very often. And certainly explain why. And then I've added, you may or may not get the editor to comply. That is, sometimes authors do say that there's some sort of tension developing that they don't want it to go back to a reviewer. And be careful about this because, again, everything is anonymous, but one of the things we all like to do, right, is try to guess who that reviewer is, especially in that situation. And I personally, and what I tell my own graduate students and postdocs in this situation, I just don't go there. I just find that a waste of time and energy. But nonetheless, it does happen. And again, so the editor may or may not acquiesce to that. And usually you try to use the same reviewers for the re-review because there's a legitimate concern. All right. The resubmission letter. So quote the reviewer. Be fairly careful about that. Especially on items that maybe there's a rather extensive change. You want to make sure that what you have changed follows what the reviewer has suggested, or in some cases, you want to be clear about, okay, the reviewer has said this, but we have responded in this way. And in some cases, maybe you've chosen not to respond to that because perhaps the reviewer has missed some point, or it was covered elsewhere already in your paper. There's all sorts of circumstances here, but be clear about it in all cases. So address the remark and clearly indicate in your response action, i.e. what changes were made to the manuscript in response to that point. And I guess I could have added there, maybe, and if you're not making changes, be clear about that too. This goes without saying and is very easy to do nowadays. Color coding, putting in quotes, different fonts, boldface, etc., all to help make it clear what you have done to address the reviewer's main comments. And because, again, in the 30 minutes to an hour that perhaps I'm spending with the manuscript, it really helps to be able to pull that up on the screen and see where the change is versus the original manuscript. And that's quite easy to do with a couple of screens and all these things that we can do nowadays. Okay, never assume that the editor is an expert in your particular specialty. Now, maybe that sounds like a contradiction from what I said earlier, where the editor-in-chief sends it to the editor that has the expertise in that area. But again, we're generalist in some sense, and we can't be experts in all areas. We hope we're reasonably knowledgeable about what we're handling, but in your response, never assume that you can dismiss something or just don't overuse jargon, and just be careful of and explain it in a way assuming that the editor maybe isn't a total expert in the area. He or she might be, but don't necessarily assume that. Never assume that the editor has the time to extensively study your paper. Right, we can't read between the lines, right? So this is important, just to keep that in mind. And I've added on that this is the thankless job of the reviewer. That is, the reviewer has extensively studied your paper. And I'm always amazed at how reviewers almost always, maybe close to always, take their responsibility for reviewing it very seriously. That's always something I've been impressed with in the whole peer review system, and maybe that has to do with the experience of how you've chosen the reviewers, and over time you become knowledgeable about how reviewers do approach their task. But most reviewers really do a pretty good job, and really this is a thankless job of the reviewer. And of course, as I've said, it's all anonymous. Okay, rebutting. Rebutting reviewers is okay. You're the authors of the paper, and for many years I worked with, in inorganic chemistry with a very prominent inorganic chemist who will go nameless, but I'm sure Professor Hupp will know what I'm talking about. And he would often say at the end of these sorts of back and forth with reviewers that in the end, the paper is really the author's responsibility. Yes, the journal has some responsibility for what it publishes. The reviewers have responsibility. They put some time and effort into this. But in the end of this whole process, it's really the author's paper. And even though I've had some disagreements with authors, and I've had disagreements with reviewers, and we've had this to and fro, at the end of the day, I still think this was actually pretty good advice. It is the author's paper. And if it's published, it's the author's responsibility, and it's going to reflect on the authors, right? And that's, for me at least, the period at the end of that sentence. Okay, so rebutting reviewers is okay, but be polite, precise, and very clear. And after all is said and done, it's really your paper. Okay. Requesting that person X not be a reviewer without a clear explanation of the conflict of interest won't work. Now, this is could be said different ways, because if you've submitted papers to the ACS, of course, we ask you nowadays to supply a list of potential reviewers, and you can also put reviewers that you don't, a non-preferred list. So there's one opportunity to do that. But later, in your letter to the editor, if there really is some sort of conflict of interest or some history on this, one can make that known. That's fair, right? Okay. All right, so I think I've gone through the slides if they were all here. So now I think it's time for some questions.
Hold on, let us get you a microphone.
Oh, okay. Just perhaps a little bit of a philosophical question, but
okay, what's good ones? There's a lot of them in this field.
Good. What's your opinion on the like double-blind policy, where authors and the reviewers remain nameless for the publishing, to enhance publishing quality or prevent name marketing and branding? In recent years, there's been more and more discussion of that. I'm not aware of any ACS journal that's gone that route, however, right? So I guess the answer is there in the fact, right, that ACS journals don't do that. For me personally, science is still a rather personal endeavor, and the people we know and who we talk to and who we collaborate with, for me, that isn't something that I would just naturally gravitate to, that kind of reviewing. That's my own personal opinion, but as I said, I don't think any ACS journal does it.
No, they don't. And actually, the only thing that I would do is our editor-in-chief wrote an editorial about this a few months ago, and I can send that to anybody. He has some opinions about it as well that are kind of interesting.
You might want to just, who is that? Which
sorry,
editor?
Analytical Chemistry and Royce Murray. And actually, you're going to get a couple of his editorials handouts during my talk. So, and if you want to know, I can send you the link if you would like to. I can give you my business.
So it is something that's been often discussed. So it's not ignored, but we don't go that way. Anybody in the audience not published a paper yet? Okay. Well, let me just maybe end with a comment about your experience as a researcher, postdoc summer researcher here, and how it really is a big deal. Your first paper, I think, and your second and your third. And I think for myself, it's still a big deal many papers later. Publishing is important in science and what we do in our profession. It really is one of the main tangible results of what we do in research. And so I want to say be aggressive about it. I mean, carry out the research, being thoughtful about it, and make sure that it's not lost. And one of the things I often tell my graduate students in terms of how we decide what to publish, yes, we can put information that's not ready to be published in a thesis, but what we really don't want to do is to have research that's really completed and then not publish it. That's really a loss. And that's the job of all of us, the person who's supervising the research, your coworkers, but in some respects, it's also mainly your responsibility, the person who's actually doing the experiments, generating the data. It's much more of a bottom-up. It's a process that all of us have to do and get the results published when the work is finished. Okay? Good. It's fun.